And the organization I work for, the Western Landowners Alliance, we are all in. We are a landowner-founded, landowner-led, West-wide organization of individuals who steward lands, landowners and managers who are dedicated to keeping the working lands of the West whole and healthy for the benefit of people and wildlife. And the really cool thing is that our members come from across the entire political spectrum, from every kind of land interest and from every walk of life. But what unites us, our common ground, is a love of the land and our sense of responsibility and gratitude in our relationship to it. So the observation that land is kin gets right to the heart of what I wanted to visit with you about here tonight. In his land ethic, Aldo Leopold defined land as a living community that includes not only humans, but the soils, the waters, the plants, and the animals. And he said, when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And I think that many of us raised in the environmental community, in the environmental era, is what I meant to say, over the past 50 years, have focused on Aldo Leopold's call to see land as a living community and to use it with love and respect. But I'm not so sure, however, that we have equally embraced this notion that land is a community to which we belong. I came of age in the 70s and 80s amidst an increasingly prevailing worldview that people are by and large bad for nature. And given the human impacts on the environment, this position is understandable. And yet, this notion is at odds with many rural and indigenous perspectives, which hold that people are part of land and part of nature. Recognizing this fundamental difference in worldviews between people and is important if we're going to find solutions to the many challenges that we face today, both in environment and in agriculture. And not long ago, I was trying to reconcile these two different worldviews, and I had this kind of an epiphany, and it went like this. Let's say you're a child raised in a household where from the time you're born, you're told that you are unnatural, that you are bad for your community, that the best thing you can do as you come of age is to try to walk lightly and not hurt what's out there, right? How would you walk in the world? How would you walk in your community and inside yourself if you were raised that way? Contrast this with a child raised in a household where you're told from the very earliest days that you are a vital, important member of your community, that the community relies on you, that it looks to you, and that in turn it is there to nurture and support you, and you have an important role to play with that community. How do you walk in the world and in yourself and with others with that in mind? The need to reconsider how we understand ourselves in relation to the living community was driven home to me one time by an experience I had with my son. He was 7 years old. We were on vacation in Nicaragua. We were sitting on the stoop of a restaurant waiting for dinner to be served. And it was a beautiful, balmy evening, and I was just soaking in the beauty and the scenery, waiting for dinner. And my son put his head in his hands, and all kids, hold your ears here, and he said, "Mama, the world is a bad place, isn't it?" And my heart just broke. And I said, "Why did you say that?" He said, "Well, because we ruin everything." And I thought, how did he come to that? And I realized that I had been carrying home a lot of negativity about what we were doing on the planet, but he was also getting that negativity from schools and from zoos and museums and magazines and children's books. It's all around us. I don't know about you guys, but I grew up in nature, just falling in love with it, being out on the land, relishing it, and I didn't have somebody over my shoulder scolding about this, right? I think we need to give that back to our children. Children, enjoy the land. It's there for you, right? You're a part of it. Now, we would have to be willfully blind not to see the weight of our footprint on this planet. And yet, we're also not aliens descended onto an innocent planet. We actually co-evolved with this earth and with all of the species that we hold dear. And down to our very cellular biology, as Nicole Masters likes to point out, we are part of the living land, of the living community of this planet. We are literally a product and an expression of nature at this particular point in time, in this particular place on this particular planet. And so in this sense, very literally, we are not exceptional, but rather we're comprised wholly of nature. And in fact, there has long been a perspective among many indigenous communities that the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land. So take a moment to absorb that, to feel that relationship all the way down to your cellular level. I think that the more urbanized we become, the more nature is something that we see out the window, or we visit on the weekends, or we idealize at a distance, the easier it is for us to lose track of this connection. And while I have always loved the idea and the experience of what we call wilderness today, over my career I have come to realize that the future of both wildlife and people actually rests in the conservation and stewardship of our working lands. These working lands are the cornerstones of both our human communities and our ecosystems. These are the fertile valley bottoms. These are the places that are habitable year-round. These are the places with water and game and timber. And these places early on went into private ownership and became our farms and ranches. So these truly are the best, richest places for all of us. Up to 80% of wildlife species depend on private and working lands for survival. Up to 2/3 of endangered species do. And these lands are economically and ecologically dependent in the West across the public and private land boundary. But here's the thing that's really easy to forget in today's urbanized society. While the great majority of wildlife depends on these working lands for survival, 100% of humans depend on these working lands for survival. There are many important things in our lives, but under every single thing, under every one of those, is the land that makes our existence possible. When I was a child, I spent many of my days outdoors in nature, roaming the woods of the National Forest near where I lived. I rammed the woods and the meadows and enjoyed the powdery blue butterflies and playing with worms in the puddles after a rain and listening to the birds in the trees. And it was kind of an ecstasy for me, and often I stayed out nearly until dark before making my way home to the little A-frame cabin that my family had in this in-holding, the warmth of its yellow lights beckoning me out of the twilight, back to my family, to a warm dinner on the table, to pajamas, and to bed. I fell in love with nature and with wildlife, but then one day, as I ventured out in there, I was devastated to encounter a large logging operation. Big machines and men with chainsaws were taking down the woods that I had come to love, and I was shocked and I was horrified. And from that day forward, well into adulthood, I held a hostile view of the forest industry, which quickly translated into a hostility towards anything else that seemed to me to encroach or threaten the wild places that I loved, and initially led me to a career in environmental journalism. But by absolute chance, I stumbled into a job managing a large conservation ranch in southern Colorado. And my experience on the ground over the next 16 years as a ranch manager, and then in the next 12 years in my experience here with the Western Landowners Alliance, has expanded my thinking in ways that I never would have expected. And that learning, that change continues to this day. The one thing I did not understand as a child, confronted by that forestry operation, that I understand today as a responsible adult with a child of my own, was that my own house was made of wood harvested from a forest, and that the lights in which and the warmth which beckoned me back home in the evening were powered by electricity and gas, and that the food on the table and the clothes on my body and the sheets and the blankets on my bed came from raw materials produced from forests and farms and rangelands and energy fields. And the ongoing loss of these working lands and the resources that they supply poses an existential threat to all of us. Bloomberg ran an article this spring that said, headlined, "The world is quietly losing the places it needs to feed itself, the land it needs to feed itself." And you don't have to look far to witness this. Montana's lost 500,000 acres of agricultural land just in the last ag census from 2017 to 2022. We've lost 10% of our family farms, and you see this all over the West in even much bigger numbers and throughout the world. And this should be of great concern to all of us. The more land we lose, the more land we take out of production here at home and abroad, the more pressure we put on other lands and ecosystems. And we can only conclude two things from this. One, we need to slow the loss of these working lands here and abroad, and we need to make sure that these working lands can sustain both people and wildlife. And that's why, in the coming decades, the focus of conservation will inevitably turn to working lands and the people that take care of them for us. Aldo Leopold described this as the oldest task in human history, which is to learn to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And today, it's not only the oldest task, but on a very crowded planet, it's our most urgent task. So in this process, I believe we need to expand the definition of conservation to include this notion of human stewardship. If you think about beavers and pollinators and what they contribute to the ecosystems, how they enrich them, human beings have that same capacity. And you can see this from the earliest indigenous food gardens to our irrigated fields and pastures surrounding us here today. We have the capacity to restore and enrich the lands that sustain us, but that does not happen by itself. It requires investments of time and money, not just one time, but on an ongoing basis. That's a change in thinking we've got to get into our heads as a society. Conservation on working lands is fundamentally different from the preservation of wilderness. And this is because with wilderness, we're segregating, separating, and protecting nature from people. But with working lands, it's the opposite. We're actually trying to integrate people and natural systems and the land together, right? And so the strategies are going to be fundamentally different because in the context of working lands, people matter, livelihoods matter, community matters, relationships matter. So when it comes to working lands, we need to rethink conservation from the ground up. And it needs to be led by people close to the land, people in local communities, people on the land. This is where this needs to happen. It cannot happen from Washington, D.C., from desk jockeys. With all due respect, it can't happen from there. We have to lead this right here. This new era of conservation creates an opportunity for people to come back together in shared vision and common cause. And the good news is this is not only possible, but it's happening. And over the past 30 years, organizations like the Blackfoot Challenge, the Malpai Borderlands Group have demonstrated the power of collaborative conservation to solve complex challenges in these landscapes. And yet at the same time, as powerful as collaborative conservation is, there are forces that are far beyond local influence. So if you step back for a moment and consider the landscape from a 50,000-foot level, what's shaping it? What's causing the kind of land uses that we see today? It's economics, right? That's really what's driving the change out on the landscape. It's what's driving nature off the map. So how do we better align economics to support conservation and stewardship on working lands, and who should pay? We in the agricultural community have long heard from wildlife advocates that farmers and ranchers should not be compensated for the cost of sustaining public wildlife because it should be considered a part of the cost of doing business. We hear, why should the public pay for what landowners already are or should be doing? But I'll tell you today that because we're not paying this, because we've been unwilling to pay these costs as a society, it's exactly why we're losing these resources at the rate that we're losing them. Cities and suburbs, I live in a suburb these days, I'm sad to say, but they occupy what was once some of the best, most biologically rich habitats on Earth. But you do not find grizzlies and wolves anymore in downtown San Francisco or Denver. You don't find Chiricahua leopard frogs or black-footed ferrets there either. We have driven wildlife out of these places, and most of us who live there have never paid the cost of those impacts. Taxpayer contributions to conservation at state and federal levels are negligible. And I always have this little picture in my mind. So you're at the farmer's market, there's a booth selling meat, and there's a booth selling dried flowers, and there's a booth over here selling, fruit and cheeses and what have you. And then there's this booth down at the end, and it's some poor guy out there, he's got a little card and it says wildlife habitat stewardship. So if you're at the farmer's market on a busy Saturday morning and you're looking for the shortest line, that might be the one, right? So how do we fix that? When the working lands community and land base is shrinking by the hour, we cannot bear the entire moral and financial responsibility of conserving and stewarding these resources while continuing to produce healthy and affordable food. And conservation isn't just something you buy. It's not something that's one and done, but instead it's about the way that we live. It's about the way we produce food. It's about the way we care for land, and there is a cost to this. And people need to be able to earn a livelihood while caring for the resources on which we all depend. In short, it takes a community to sustain a community. We need a shared vision for our lands and communities, one that recognizes our deep interconnectedness with nature and our absolute dependency on land and natural resources for our own survival. Nature in a bubble is not a solution. Nature as a playground is not the path forward. Annihilation of nature surely isn't the answer. And forcing people off the land is not the answer. But working together to invest in, conserve, and care for the lands that sustain us is a path forward. And I would argue it's the only path forward, and that's what's happening right here, right now, at the Old Salt Festival. And I want us to be able to celebrate and recognize this moment and support it. You guys, let's keep it going. Thank you.